Well, welcome to session number 7. Sean is not here, but I'm taking his place in a way. And we're now about to listen to Robin Koning.
Lost for words.
The whole of chapters 1 to 4 in method and theology. So, Robin, and welcome again to all our friends online. We're about to begin.
Good. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I put the heaters on to warm up the room a bit, and I left a note on the board there: turn off heaters. I'll have to leave before 1, so I won't be here to clean up everything. But so thanks, Stephen. I confess that this is going to be a rather dull journeyman sort of paper compared to the creative applications. I don't think you'll have 2,500 questions after this. Sorry. Only 25, yeah. Stephen had more, yeah. It's none of the great creativity we've had in this workshop. It takes up the question of the role of the first 4 chapters of Method and Theology, the role they play in that book that's specifically focused on theological method. So it's not going to come with anything new or terribly insightful for those of you who are familiar with method. That's why I begged the workshop committee to put this paper earlier in the piece so that we could finish with something more stimulating. But at their last meeting that I wasn't at, they decided against this. So you can blame them that we're ending with a whimper rather than a bang of this conference. I take some comfort from the fact that at least some of you are not so familiar with method, might learn something perhaps. Given the title of Method in Theology, one might have thought the book could have started at chapter 5 on functional specialties. It's here that Lonergan outlines his proposal for theological method in terms of functional specialization. Having laid out his rationale for this approach, he could have continued, as the book does, with chapters on each of the functional specialties. Certainly, the opening paragraph of chapter 5 makes clear that this is where his presentation of theological method as such really starts. To put method in theology is to conceive theology as a set of related and recurrent operations cumulatively advancing towards an ideal goal. All that might have been needed to set that statement in context would be the first couple of sections of chapter 1, where he speaks about method in general. Then he could have taken up his point about what it means to put method into theology. Certainly Lonergan initially intended for this chapter on functional specialties to come earlier in the book. He says in an interview, the chapter on functional specializations is not going to be chapter 2 as he had planned when he sent the paper to the Gregorianum. It's chapter 5 now, and it has the 4 background chapters. So that wasn't his original plan. He doesn't say what would have been chapter 1, but we find a clue in some of the summer courses that he gave over the time he was writing Method, where he's really reading out the text of his draft of Method. In the 1968 Boston College course, he began with lectures entitled Method, which closely followed the first chapter of the book. So presumably that would have been when he proposed that functional specialties would be chapter 2, the chapter on method in general would have been chapter 1. So what role do these 4 initial chapters play? Lonergan himself refers to the role of them in a number of ways. The table of contents of Method divides the book into 2 major sections. Chapters 6 to 14 on the various functional specialties are called foreground, while the chapters 1 to 5 are considered background. Background to what he's going to do in the main part of the book. Chapter 5, of course, is something somewhat transitional. It's somewhere between foreground and background. But another way he describes the place of these initial chapters is this. The first 4 chapters of Method and Theology underpin the practice of theology, a sense of underpinning, undergirding the practice of theology. The context of that statement is his account of the importance of religious experience for the philosophy of God. He notes that some people think that every student of religion needs to refute every argument against the existence of God before they even get started in studying religion. He disagrees with that approach, and in so doing he gives an account of the unfolding of chapters 1 to 4, how he sees them unfolding. He says much more necessary than that refuting of all the arguments against the existence of God is the self-appropriation that grounds cognitional theory, epistemology and metaphysics that provides for the criteria for distinguishing positions from counterpositions. So that's basically chapter 1 of method. That leads into an account of the human good, which is chapter 2. That extends into a general theory of meaning, which is chapter 3. And that brings to light the human capacity for self-transcendence and the relation between that capacity and religion, which is really chapter 4. So it says those are the topics treated in the first 4 chapters. They underpin the practice of theology. In the same talk, Lonergan speaks of those chapters in a related way, saying that they provide the philosophy that the theologian needs. And when he says that, he's saying it's not just any old philosophy, of course, but first of all, transcendental method in chapter 1, an apprehension of the human good, so that we're able to say why religion is good. Chapter 2, an account of meaning and all its varieties and differences, etc., especially for those 3 functional specialties that he mentions, interpretation, history, and communication. And what is religion? What is the question about God in chapter 4? And at the end of chapter 1 of Method himself, he again connects chapter 1 with chapter 4 initially, and then backtracks to chapters 2 and 3. Transcendental method is only a part of theological method. That's chapter 1 is transcendental method. It supplies the basic anthropological component of theological method. It doesn't supply the specifically religious component. Accordingly, to advance from transcendental to theological method, it's necessary to add a consideration of religion in chapter 4. And before we can speak of religion, we must first say something about the human good in chapter 2, and about human meaning, which is chapter 3, of course. So there's a number of places where Lonergan outlines how he sees these chapters unfolding and underpinning and giving us the basic philosophy grounded in transcendental method that he sees as being necessary for theology. Another way of looking at the role of these underpinning background chapters is in terms of Lonergan's definition of theology, which we've seen a couple of times over these days, mediating between a cultural matrix and the significance and role of a religion in that matrix. So just diagrammatically, theology is doing some mediating between culture and religion. So that definition of theology and that mediating role would suggest that a chapter on religion would be important background. If this is what theology is, then we need to say something about religion. We might also expect a chapter on culture, which we don't have as such. I say not as such because we just need to look at Lonergan's definition of culture, a set of meanings and values informing a common way of life. So to where Lonergan talks about culture, he does it by talking about meaning and meanings, a set of meanings and values, which is chapter 3 again, and of value, which forms a large part of chapter 2, of course. And of course, for Lonergan, one can't speak of meaning and value without engaging with the subject's intentional consciousness and speaking about that, which is precisely what he does in chapter 1. So in his very definition of theology, we can find a sense of why he has those introductory chapters on values, meanings, and religion and transcendental method. Another way in which Lonergan speaks of the role of these chapters is in terms of the provision of general categories for theology. In theology, you have both general and special categories. The special categories are those specific to theology, things like grace and sin, for example. General categories are employed in other disciplines as well. Theology becomes a reflection on the significance and value of a religion within a culture. Again, significance to do with meaning, value, the values, religion, chapter 4. Because it treats of religion, it has its own special terms. Because it's concerned with the significance and value of the religion, it has to have a recourse to the general terms that refer to significance and value and culture in their many aspects. There's provision of special general categories. Yeah. So these initial chapters provide us with a range of general categories which, while not unique to theology, are going to be essential for theology as it seeks to mediate between a culture and the significance and role of a religion within that culture. This emphasis on the general categories has raised the question for many as to whether the method Lonergan proposes with his 8 functional specialties is an entirely general method applicable to any discipline. Karl Rahner famously asked that question, suggesting that the method could be applied to any human science that was fully conscious of itself as depending on the past and looking towards the future. Lonergan agrees with Rahner that that's true. And in fact, in his account of the functional specialties in chapter 5, there are various hints of the broader application. Even though he's applying it particularly to theology, there are hints of a broader possible application. So, for example, in section 1 of that chapter 5, where he introduces functional specialization by comparing and contrasting it with field and subject specialization, there's nothing to suggest that the idea of functional specialization applies only to theology. Even the examples of different tasks within theology that he chooses, textual criticism, interpretation and history, are relevant to a number of other disciplines, of course. And he also speaks specifically, explicitly of functional specialization within physics in that section 1. In section 2 of chapter 5, his outline of the eightfold division also allows for application to other disciplines as well. It's most clear in the way he talks about the first 4 specialties in the first phase. He defines research initially as making available the data relevant to theological investigation, but here he's specifically, of course, talking about theology. But later on, he'll speak more generally of research simply as uncovering and making available the data, whatever they're going to be relevant to, whatever discipline we're working in. He goes on to describe the tasks of interpretation as understanding what was meant, no particular theological reference there. And he says that that special history deals with movements. He talks about cultural movements, institutional movements, and doctrinal movements. And in the examples he gives of each, religion is just one of the cultural movements. Oh, where did I go? How did I go there? I've lost something. Lost me place, sorry. Oh, there we go. So out of cultural movements, religion is just one of them, along with language and art, etc. Institutional movements, church and sect are just amongst others, and doctrinal movements, even that term doctrinal, he applies to a whole range of issues, including theology. So it's only when speaking of history explicitly as a functional specialty within theology that he narrows his concern to areas particularly relevant to theology. As for dialectic, he says it finds abundant materials in the history of Christian movements, but again, that's where there's nothing to say there wouldn't be abundant materials for histories relevant to other disciplines. At first glance, when Lonergan looks at the second phase specialties, the way he talks about them are more intimately linked to theology. Foundations, the horizon within the meaning of doctrines can be apprehended, doctrines, expressing judgments of fact and value, systematics working out appropriate systems for. That term doctrines keeps coming up, but as we've just seen, he includes many things under the area of doctrines. We tend to immediately think of theological doctrines, but where he talks about those different movements, he includes much more than that. The theology is listed alongside maths and natural science and human science in that list we just saw. And when he speaks about the link between the specialties of doctrines back to history in the first phase, he draws examples from the areas of mathematics and chemistry and medicine. As for communications, the specialty is said to be concerned with theology in its external relations. There's room here to consider any other disciplines, certainly in the human sciences, as having a concern for the 3 kinds of external relations he talks about: relations with other disciplines, communications across cultures and classes, and using various means of communication. So there's nothing within his account of the functional specialties which suggests they are only relevant to the study of theology, although he's obviously making that application. And also when he looks in section 4 at the need for a division into functional specialties, we don't find anything particular to theology in at least 3 of the points he makes. all disciplines face the same dangers that he mentions of confusing different tasks, of overvaluing one task over another, or making excessive demands on any one researcher. That'd be common to a whole range of disciplines. His second point talks about the fact that theology, one reason for functional specialization is that theology has developed to the point where two phases are distinguished. And he's earlier talked about those two phases in this way, that if one is to hearken to the word, one must also bear witness to it. If one's to engage in lectio divina, then there come to mind questiones. If one assimilates tradition, then one has to learn that one should pass it on as well. If one encounters the past, then one also has to take one's stand toward the future. In brief, he says there's a theology in a ratione obliqua that tells what Paul and John, Augustine and Aquinas and anyone else had to say about God and the economy of salvation. But there's also a theology in a ratione recta, in which the theologian, enlightened by the past, that's the obliqua, confronts the problems of the day, having been enlightened by the past. But again, while he's drawing his examples there from theology, it's not peculiar to theology, that sense of having these two sets of tasks. Any human science which has reached a certain level of development will be concerned to assimilate the past so as to bear witness to it in the present, which was precisely Rana's point about Lonergan's theological method, and significantly a point with which Lonergan himself agreed. So there's much evidence to support the thesis that despite the particular applications Lonergan makes to theology, the structure of his method, particularly the division into the functional specialties, is not specifically theological. So what remains to make it a theological method when it's applied to theology? Lonergan seems to give two different answers to this question. The first is in terms of the subject matter of theology. This is seen already in his definition of theology as mediating between a culture and a religion, that religion is part of that subject matter which makes it a theology. He makes that point in a number of places. I don't give the references here, but they're in different places. I've got them in my paper. To advance from transcendental to theological method, it's necessary to add a consideration of religion. That needs to be part of your subject matter, what you're considering. Theology is a reflection on the significance and value of religion within a culture. Theology is a reflection on religion. He says this a number of times. So on one hand, he's talking about the subject matter. What is it that we're reflecting on? But his second answer is in terms of the person doing the reflection, the theologian. The importance of conversion is what leads us into a properly theological method, that special method which is theology. The specific, did I do that or did you do that? I did. No, don't know how I did that, but I've learnt a new skill. I don't know what I did. Did I push that? No. There we go. The specific theological principle is religious conversion. For the method to be a method in theology, it must implement a specifically theological principle. Again, religious conversion. It will be a reflection on conversion. It would seem, of course, that, to me at least, that both of these are needed. Reflection on religion as the subject matter of theology and religious conversion on the part of the theologian. If we have one without the other, then we don't really have theology. One can have reflection on religion on the part of someone who's not converted, but they will not fully understand what they're studying in some of its deeper aspects. And one can be religiously converted and be engaged in a whole range of disciplines. That doesn't make them theology, the fact that I'm religiously converted. The fact that a religiously converted person studies housing or mathematics or education doesn't make their research as such into theology. It seems, I think Lon is probably saying, both of these, religion as part of the subject matter of what we look at in theology, and the need for conversion to authentically engage in theological reflection. So that's about as far as my talk. Sorry, I didn't really write a conclusion at 12 o'clock last night, but just that sense of the importance of general categories, that providing those first chapters providing the philosophy, the particular kind of philosophy that Lonergan points us to, which is grounded in chapter 1 in transcendental method, and the leading us to the question about what is theological about this method, and the fact that it's not in the methodological steps themselves, but in terms of subject matter and conversion. So I'll leave it there and open up to questions. Chair. Thank you.